She's a young mediator there. Tori, you want to say hi to Ken? State.
Hi, Ken.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay. Then we have
Hello.
Sebastian is our official Spanish English translator. his sister is actually in the symposium. They're from Ecuador. So thank you, Sebastian. Thank you, Sebastian, for doing this. Then we have Alicia. Alicia is in Canada. Alicia, you can unmute yourself. You can say hi to Ken.
Hi there, Ken. We've met a couple times over the years. Nice to see you.
Okay, so
Yes, it's a pleasure, Alicia. Nice to see you.
Grace is there. Grace is, of course, she's in Kenya. Grace, you want to unmute and say hi to Ken? Okay. Lucy is, of course, doing wonderful work. Lucy, you can unmute yourself. This is one of those rare times in my.
Oh my goodness, what a treat! No,
Yes.
I was expecting to be invisible and mute. So
That's usually what happens.
Thank you.
And of course, you know Robin. I don't need to introduce her. So, Robin, you can also unmute yourself and say hi, please. So now the thing is that, Ken, if you want, I mean, what I can do is a short introduction to the symposium as such. Let's just put that out, because some people would still come in, maybe, which of course we don't wait for them, but that can be one thing we can do. So basically, this is what we are doing right now. The symposium. This is this week. Ken. These are the people this week. So that's what happening. Robin is also this week. Alicia is this week. So this is what it is. So Indigenous Peoples and Mediation, and today is the International Day of the World's Indigenous People. So that's why we have it today. And then a bit on finding information, because the schedule is out there. So let me just put that out so that people know where to find the details. So all you have to do is actually just go to mediatorvikram.com and you'll find all the details. I think easy. So Ken, I won't waste time at all. We need to hear you. That's, I think, what is important. But if you want, I'll just put the site up for a second so that they know this is mediatorvikram.com. You'll find, of course, details on for the World Mediation Circle, which I'm creating. These are every school, every community should have one. So that's one thing. How you can support, schedule of activities, and of course, special section on Ken, all the events he's come on. And of course, YouTube channel, there's about 375 plus videos there. So there's lots of content and all that. So this is all there is. So Ken, I think we should just start, please. And I know I'm not introducing you, definitely, because it won't be right to introduce you. Everyone knows you. So please.
Well, first of all, thank you for doing this, Vikram. Thank you, first of all, for all of the interviews and all of the connections that you have been making around the world. This is incredibly important for us, and it helps understand that we are a community, and we are united by our diversity, and able to have deep conversations with one another about issues that matter. And secondly, I'd like to thank you for doing this particular session on Indigenous cultures and Indigenous approaches to conflict resolution. This is a topic that we have not paid nearly enough attention to, and one that is incredibly important and valuable for each and every one of us, as I would like to show in the comments that I will be offering in a few moments. But I'd like to begin in a slightly different way, simply by reminding us that wherever each of us is located, we are standing on ground that was once inhabited by Indigenous people. And I think it's important to acknowledge that ancestry, and also to be thankful for what we have received from those cultures, and to be apologetic for the damage that we have incurred. So I think that there are three fundamental topics around this issue. First is the contributions that have been made by Indigenous cultures to conflict resolution. And I'd like to identify 5 that I think are interesting and important and useful. Some of them people have heard of, others you may not have heard of. Secondly, I think that there is a general topic of colonialism and the impact of colonialism on Indigenous cultures, and indeed on all of our cultures. What the effects of colonialism have been in conflict resolution. And finally, I think that there's a topic of what we can think of as decolonization. That is, not just in relationship to the ending of colonialism as a geopolitical system, but decolonizing the ways that we think, the attitudes that we bring to Indigenous cultures and to Indigenous practices, some of which are not even labeled Indigenous practices, but they have echoes that reverberate into our present relationships with one another around the globe. So I'd like to touch briefly on each of those 3, but we have a short period of time and we won't be able to talk about them in much detail. And these are complex, multifaceted topics that require a great deal of study. So let's begin with an idea. And the idea is basically this. Every human being is unique, and we are gathered together in societies. In other words, we are collections of unique individuals. And in order for that to work, human societies require skills in a series of things. One, in handling diversity, in responding to differences, in how we handle and respond to dissent. And secondly, not only do we need those skills in collaboration, skills in negotiation, we require conflict resolution skills. Every human society requires conflict resolution skills. And now what we can see is that if conflict resolution is a part of every human society, then we want to take a look at how different societies have handled traditionally conflicts within and between their members. And when we begin to do this, we can see that Indigenous cultures have an incredibly rich history of conflict resolution. And yet, because of centuries of colonialism, in all of its various aspects, I think that we would have to recognize that the overwhelming majority of those have been eliminated, no longer exist. And even the ones that continue to exist have to some extent taken on a slightly different form as a result of pressures from the outside world. So part of what we want to do is to try to recapture the essence, the spirit, the kind of principal contributions that are made by Indigenous cultures to conflict resolution, because I think that it is going to be very useful for us to see our own practices in comparison to how other cultures have handled these issues. So I'd like to begin with a couple of ideas that come out of my own experience with Indigenous cultures. I have worked with First Nation cultures in Canada, Native Americans in the US, Maori, mediators in New Zealand, and Indigenous mediators in various places in Africa, in Asia, and in South America. And that over a period of several, maybe 4 decades. And some of those have been accidental, and some of those have, and just occasional, and some of those have been intentional and long-lasting. And what I'd like to do is to pick up a few pieces of what I've learned that have made an impression on me, that have influenced my practice and made me a better mediator. Here's the first. It is called the medicine wheel or spirit wheel. Sometimes Native American spirit wheel, sometimes Native American medicine wheel or First Nation medicine wheel. Medicine in First Nation cultures and Native American cultures means something spiritual. So medicine isn't just the kind of drugs that you take. It is a kind of generic term that describes the relationship between all of us and our environment. So I'm going to have to describe this to you. What I'd like you to do is to imagine for a moment a compass and the 4 compass directions, which form an XY axis. And these compass directions, north, south, east, and west, in these cultures and other indigenous cultures as well, correspond to 4 fundamental characteristics of human existence. They correspond to spirit, to mind, to body, and to emotion. And if we think about this for a moment, we can see that it is possible to understand these as locations of conflict. Where are conflicts located? First, inside of our physical bodies. Secondly, they're located in our minds, in the ways that we think. Third, they're located in our emotions. And fourth, they are located in something that we can call spirituality. And by this, I do not mean religion. I mean life energy, the quality of the energy of life that flows within and between us. And to these 4 compass directions, we now add 2 more. So there is mind, body, spirit, and emotion. There is an internal direction, which we find at the exact center of where these north, south, east, and west lines cross. And that is thought of in these cultures as the heart. And finally, there is a 6th direction, which is the external direction, the direction that corresponds to the environment. And can't we say that these also are locations in conflict? There is a heart location in every conflict, and there is an environmental aspect of conflict. Conflict has a kind of environmental impact. And so these 2 areas particularly are very important in understanding indigenous cultures. Not just those 2, but also spirit as well. So now let's take a look at what this means in terms of mediation practice. Well, if we look at US and European mediation practices, how we do our mediations, how do they begin? Well, they began with ground rules. And then they proceed to people talking about what happened to them. Perhaps there's some emotional element in that. And then there's a kind of negotiation over options, writing up of agreements. And all of this takes place within the mind. It is possible to go through many, many mediations in the United States without anyone ever asking a question about what this felt like, what it meant to you emotionally. And what we have done then is simply left out one of the most fundamental elements in every conflict. In fact, you cannot have a conflict without an emotional component. And where does this come from? And I think that the answer is it comes from the suppression of emotion that takes place in colonial and patriarchal cultures. Emotion that has a meaning that you want to try to avoid. And I'll come to that in a little bit when we come to the problem of colonialism and what it is. How do indigenous cultures largely conduct their mediations? Well, here I'm going to refer specifically to First Nation and Native American mediations, which traditionally began with everyone, the elders, particularly in a society, and the parties and the whole community, perhaps, sitting in silence, passing a peace pipe, waiting for someone to feel their spirit move, waiting for their heart to open, and speaking from their heart about what they want to see happen in this conversation. And from there is a conversation about how this felt to everyone, why it matters. And from there is a conversation about the meaning of this conflict for the community, for the social environment in which the parties live. Now, this is almost never the case, even in community mediations, of which I've done many, many of those, that we explicitly say, what is the impact of this conflict on the community, on our society, on even our family? And yet, we can easily see that these are important elements in resolving every dispute. So the Native American medicine wheel or spirit wheel gives us an opportunity to consider how we might do things differently. And here are some of the things that I would like to mention that are elements that I've picked up. And I would say, if you want to take a look at this, Robin Short, who's on our call here, has published a book that I've written called The Crossroads of Conflict. And in it is a description of the locations of conflict following this medicine wheel. And under each location, a series of different things that you might be able to do within that location. And here are some for the heart-based location. Welcoming people with an open heart. Opening the conversation with a question, an invocation, a invitation that is directed at people's hearts. Even a prayer, a wish for how we will behave towards one another. Asking people to tell each other why they want to resolve the conflict and what kind of relationship they would like to have with each other. Eliciting the heart meaning of conflict stories, opening our hearts as mediators and using them to search for questions that invite people to speak and listen from their hearts. Asking direct, honest questions that encourage integrity and trust. Being vulnerable and encouraging vulnerability in others, etc. So I can go down this list. You can find them in the book, The Crossroads of Conflict. And what they virtually always do is end with some heartfelt acknowledgement and appreciation for what it is that people have done. This forms a small part of Western mediation practice, but it is something that virtually every Indigenous culture has as a central part of its practice. Here's a second idea, and I call this one loving confrontation. So in most non-Indigenous US European cultures, mediations take place within what we can think of as, in fact, virtually every mediation takes place within what we can think of as a conflict culture. And Western cultures are often highly emotional, very competitive, very self-centered, very adversarial, and very confrontational. And again, I think we have to look at why this is the case and what the connection between these sort of responses is. And one of the projects of Western culture, which is one that I will describe when we come to colonialism. So these shape our communications and turn them into confrontations that are nearly always grounded in negative emotions like anger, fear, jealousy, grief, shame, etc. And then mediators try to diffuse those emotions and reframe them using a variety of different techniques. In Indigenous cultures, by contrast, there is a kind of a widely respected cultural support for grounding the conversation in more positive emotions that are heart-based, empathy-inducing, sometimes emotionally poignant, and oriented towards reinforcing social bonds and relationships. And these sometimes take the form of loving confrontations between people who've engaged in behavior that is damaging to the community, to the tribe, to the culture, to the society. And most of what we are talking about when we are talking about Indigenous cultures is more small scale human societies. And size does make a difference when it comes to conflict resolution. So what does supportive or loving confrontation consist of? Here's an example given by the writer Alice Walker of the approach that is taken by people in the Bayamba tribe in Southern Africa to anyone who's engaged in conflict or behaving badly or aggressively towards others or selfishly or whatever the behavior may happen to be. And I'm now going to quote this. Here's what she says. Here's what happens in the among the Bayamba. When a person, quote, this is a quote, when a person acts irresponsibly or unjustly, he is brought to the center of the village, alone and unfettered. All work ceases, and every man, woman, and child in the village gathers in a large circle around the accused individual. Then each person in the tribe speaks to the accused, and if it's not just the individual who's accused, it's the two people who are in conflict with each other, who are then separated and spoken to separately. Then each person in the tribe speaks to the accused one at a time about all the good things that person has done in their lifetime. all his positive attributes, good deeds, strengths, and kindnesses are recited carefully and at length. The tribal ceremony often lasts several days. At the end, the tribal circle is broken. A joyous celebration takes place, and the person is symbolically and literally welcomed back into the tribe. Now, to me, this is an unbelievably civilized approach to conflict resolution. Not primitive at all. This is highly sophisticated and well beyond the capacity, I would say, of most skilled mediation practitioners, possibly because they just haven't thought of it. And I have actually, with it before even knowing about this, used this approach in a variety of cases, particularly in juvenile victim offender mediations, with unbelievable positive impact. This is supportive confrontation in a powerful way. Here's another example, also from Africa. And there are several cultures in which women who are about to give birth leave the community and go out into the bush or the forest, accompanied by other women who are going to help them and care for them. And one of the tasks of these women is to help to create a song that will welcome the child into the world and become their personal song. They sing this song during childbirth to invite the child into the world. And they sing the song every year on the child's birthday. And when the child gets into conflict or behaves badly, members of the community sing the song again to the child to remind them of who they actually are and that they can do better. Isn't that beautiful? What is contained within both of these examples is something fundamental which we lose sight of. And that is that everybody who engages in conflict and behaves badly and becomes hostile and adversarial and nasty and mean has lost their own true self. How do we remind them of who they actually are? And we have a few subtle ways of doing this. And I want to tell you that I need to say this, I guess I should have said this in advance. I am not advocating that we copy mindlessly what other cultures have done. What I'm advocating is that we learn from them and find ways of incorporating into each of our different cultures elements and ideas and insights and wisdom that comes from these examples. So what are these really doing? Well, we can see that they are speaking directly to the heart of the injured person, the defended heart, and asking that they dismantle those defenses. And this is similar to, and at the same time, a step beyond what Fisher and Urey describe in their magnificent book, Getting to Yes, which is separate the person from the problem, be hard on the problem and soft on the person. Only this isn't just being soft on the person. This is actually finding the source of conflict within the person in terms of their own internal conflict. And again, I see these as highly civilized ways of integrating the need for acknowledgement. And one of the things that I have discovered in conflict resolution is that there are people who are absolutely defended against criticism and attack. and defenseless against acknowledgement. Too tough for them. They can't handle it. And kids who commit crimes are especially in this category. Here's a third methodology. This also is from Africa, especially Southern Africa, especially Angola, Mozambique, but with echoes in other places. And I have done some work in Mozambique, and there are echoes of it also in Zimbabwe, where I've also worked. And this is called palaver, which I sometimes think of as the talking cure. And it's a Portuguese word, and it comes from the presence of the Portuguese in Southern Africa. Palaver basically is done like this. And there are certain areas where palaver has come to mean a kind of a tribal or village council, in the same way that the panchayat system that you're probably familiar with, Vikram, in India, Pakistan, has kind of two meanings. One is a kind of ancient conflict resolution set of practices, and the other is it's a village council. It's a place where, kind of decisions can be made by a group of elders, and we'll come to the role of elders in a moment. So what happens is whenever there's a conflict or a problem or a difficulty, people are called together in the community. And there is an open, totally inclusive, children added where they want to, nonstop dialogue, which can go on all through the night and sometimes last for several days, and ends when the community reaches complete consensus about what happened or what needs to be done to fix and correct it. So in Portugal and some European and colonial cultures, the word palaver sometimes means just endless, useless conversation. But here it has a fundamentally different meaning, which is out of our collective intelligence, out of our diversity, out of all of the life experiences that every one of us has had throughout our lives, we should be able to figure something out about what to do about this problem. And by talking together and listening to each other and slowly, gradually accommodating our views to what others' views are, we begin to discover something new. Here's a fourth technique. And this is not quite as common today. You have to go into some of the most removed areas on the planet in order to find communities that still practice it. But it has an ancient lineage, and it's called self-sentencing. And that's my term for it. In these cultures, when someone engages in adversarial behavior or gets into conflict or behaves badly or breaks the rules or commits a crime, and for some reason the community believes that it's necessary to impose some sanction or punishment on the person who did it, perhaps in order to discourage future incidents, or something like that, then what happens is they have to come up with a penalty. And the first one to say what the penalty should be is the person who it is going to be imposed on. That's why I call it self-sentencing. So what is this about? Why is it that we ask that person to speak first? And the answer is because we're using it as a way of figuring out, do they get it? So if somebody proposes a penalty that is inconsequential, self-serving, non-existent, minimal, then other people in the tribe or community including those who've suffered as a result of that behavior, are likely to see it as symbolic of a lack of remorse, denial of responsibility, insufficient empathy, selfishness in attitude, and say, okay, that's how you feel, forget it. We're going to double the penalty because you don't get it. And we need to understand here that what you have done has hurt other people. And if you don't get that, you don't belong in this community. And in some Polynesian cultures, this includes cutting down their coconut tree, the palm that gives them coconuts, which is their source of life. And that symbolic action is taken to say, you are dead to us. No more food for you within our community. That's pretty serious. That's like a death penalty. And we have remnants of this in Western culture as well. The most famous example is Socrates in ancient Athens. You all know, I'm sure, that Socrates was a famous philosopher and taught philosophy, but was accused of having corrupted the youth of Athens, teaching them that their gods were not real, etc., and making it life difficult for them by asking troublesome questions. And so he was tried before a jury, and the jury, of course, was chosen by a process which is called sortition, in which every Athenian citizen had to serve in some capacity. And so this is really a jury of citizens. And the first question that they asked Socrates was, what do you think your punishment should be? Does anybody know what his answer was? Angela, do you know? Were you saying yes?
Does she?
You're muted, Angela.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did he have to drink poison?
Well, he had to drink the hemlock, but that came afterwards.
Okay.
When they asked him what his punishment should be, he said, free meals for life. Because that's what they gave people who had contributed immensely to the Athenian community. He was saying, I should be honored for what I've done. So they actually paradoxically gave him what he wanted, and he had his one meal, which was the cup of hemlock that killed him. But the reason that the death penalty was imposed in part was because everybody saw it as arrogance. And that's an example of this. On the other hand, in indigenous cultures, if somebody proposes a penalty that is too severe, everybody else in the tribe or community will see it as indicating genuine remorse, acceptance of responsibility, empathy for those who suffered, an altruistic attitude towards others, and then show mercy. And for a long period of time in Western culture, mercy was considered to be a high virtue, but we almost never use that word anymore. But what mercy actually means for us as conflict resolvers is forgiveness. That is, we are not just saying that we're going to forgive and forget. We're going to create restitution and welcome you back into the fold. So we want to forgive and reconcile, but here we come to the wonderful title of the South African process, Truth and Reconciliation, because the reconciliation depends on the truth. Going back to Athens, Aristotle defined justice as, in quotes, due proportion, meaning that too much reward isn't fair, and too little reward isn't fair. Too much punishment isn't fair. Too little punishment isn't fair. So justice is always about proportionality. How do you know what the correct proportion is? And the difficulty, of course, is that you can't. And I say this as someone who's been a judge. And it's not possible to figure out what the single universally correct answer is with any human being. Instead, what we require is some approximation. And more importantly than that, what we have to see is that there is something deeper that is taking place here that skews the proportion. And one of those pieces that skews the question of proportion is social division within the division of society into haves and have-nots, rich and poor. The tendency on the part of the law and the sentence to follow those divisions. More punishment for the poor, less punishment for the rich. And this is pretty clearly the case everywhere. Anatole France, famous French writer, said, in quotes, he described how, this is a quote, the law in its majestic equality forbids the rich as well as the poor from sleeping under bridges and begging in the streets for bread. And so this question of how we handle people's behaviors takes on a new form. And we describe this in modern mediation practice as power balancing. That is, we're trying to create solutions that are fair for what people have experienced without automatically skewing the outcome according to their power. But there's a hidden piece of this as well that is, I think, involved in this self-sentencing part. And that is, Hegel described it, the German philosopher Hegel described it very interestingly. He wrote that the criminal, and I'm going to give you this as a quote, has a right to punishment. The criminal has a right to punishment. Why? Because the criminal is a citizen who is responsible for making and enforcing the laws. And so any failure to punish anybody who has done something that violates the laws strips citizenship of its meaning. Isn't that interesting? This is actually very different from the way that we handle it, in which anyone who's convicted of felony in the United States is stripped of citizenship, and in certain other countries as well. So what self-sentencing ends up being is not only a kind of useful technique in figuring out what it is that should happen, but it's also much more democratic. It's more respectful and dignified and empowering and mediative. Here's an example of a case where I did this, again, without thinking about this. Not just one, I won't give one case because I've done it in multiple cases, which is if there's going to be a penalty that is going to go for someone in a mediation setting, how do you handle that penalty? And here's my way of doing it. I asked this question, what penalty would you suggest that would actually stop you from doing this again? I did this in a case of a mother who went into her ex-husband's house, grabbed her kids, kicked her husband, had a huge physical fight with the husband's new girlfriend, and dragged the kids kicking and screaming out of their house. I asked her, did she feel that she had done the right thing? She said no. She agreed that she hadn't. Are you going to do it again? No. And then to him, do you accept that? He says, no, I don't believe her. And I said, what would make you believe her? And he said, I don't know. So that's when I asked her this question. What penalty would you suggest that would prevent you from doing this again? And she said, 1 month without seeing my kids. Sound right? Did to her, did to him, done. Okay, so this is another way of doing it. The last one that I want to mention, before turning to the question of colonialism and talking just a little bit together about that, and I want to open it up for any questions or comments anybody wants to make. The last one is one that we all pretty much have heard of. We know about, to some extent, it has an interesting, made an interesting transition into modern practice, and that is what we call restorative justice. And I sometimes use the term social mediation. Restorative justice really originated in Maori culture in New Zealand, Aboriginal culture in Australia. It's used very widely in First Nation communities in Canada, Native Americans in the US. And what it consists of is seeking to heal not only the victims of what bad behavior has taken place, but the offenders, their families, and the communities to which they belong. And it does this by encouraging dignity and respect toward everyone, including the aggressor, the wrongdoer, the perpetrator, the criminal, not out of a sense of fear or weakness or some promise of reward, but a sense of commonality, that all of us belong in the same community, and we need to find ways of restoring the relationships that we had before. What I'm going to describe is not the Indigenous culture itself, but kind of the five central ideas in a kind of modern generic form that restorative justice is based on. Here are the five central ideas. One, crime is an offense not only against the state, which is what crime is defined as within most advanced legal systems. It is a crime. A crime is an act against the state, but also against the victims. That part is frequently recognized. Against the communities and the societies, which is almost never recognized. Against the relatives of all the injured parties, including, let's just stop with that one. Here's the second principle. Victims, offenders, relatives, neighbors, and communities are all impacted by the crime, and everybody should be able to participate in addressing and resolving it, understanding why it took place, agreeing on what needs to happen to repair the damage it caused, and participate actively in the rehabilitation and redemption of the offender, helping them reach forgiveness and reconciliation and restoring normality for everyone. Many years ago, I was doing some work in Cuba and attended what it was called a popular tribunal, people's tribunal, which is kind of like a sort of, it's similar to a kind of panchayat system, but it was kind of along the restorative justice model, but without, I think, unconsciously. And what happened was there was a high school kid who was getting into trouble in the neighborhood, breaking into people's houses, stealing things, sort of behaving badly. And so everybody gathered together, and present were not only the victims and the offender, but the offender's relatives, including his aunts and uncles, who would not let him get away with this because they now were looking bad by their members of their community and didn't want to be perceived this way. And so the people who were leading the tribunal said, well, why were you doing this? He says, well, I don't really know. And his aunt stands up and says, don't lie to us. So they're not there to support him. They're there to put him on the spot. Don't lie to us. Tell us what you're really thinking. And so now the whole community starts to jump in and talk about it. And then the mother talks and says, look, I work every day. My husband works every day. We're not there when he gets home from school. We just can't do it. We can't watch him. And so then some of the other relatives and neighbors say, well, I'll take Tuesday afternoon and I will be there when he comes home from school. Well, I'll take Wednesday. Somebody else, I'll take Thursday. And now the whole community is participating in the rehabilitation of this kid. And the final thing that is said by one of the victims. And the final thing that says is, we do not give you permission to destroy yourself. We need you in this community. We value you. We love you. We do not give you permission to destroy your own goodness. Everybody's in tears, especially the kid who did it. And it was a very powerful, incredible event. So that's the second, back to the two principles that crime is an offense, not just against the state, but against everybody, that everybody who's impacted by it should be able to participate in the conversation. Number three is government's role in this should be limited to just preserving safety if necessary, being cooperative and supportive, but not running the show. That justice should not be based on revenge or retributive forms of retribution or punishment that only make people worse. Here again, we go back to Socrates, who had a great question that he asked in one of his dialogues. If you twist a plow, do you make it better? If you beat an animal, do you make it more cooperative? Do you make it a better animal? And don't we do the same thing with human beings? So we need to do better than punishment. Finally, that the focus should not be exclusively on the past, but on the future. Not just on humiliation of the offender, but on the learning of the offender. And the whole point of humiliation is to stimulate learning, the unspoken purpose of it, not on the facts exclusively, but on attitudes, on what is heartfelt, on emotions, not just on the laws, but on honesty and integrity and love and mercy and compassion. So what happens in restorative justice practices, and I can tell you that probably one of the most profound experiences I had with this was doing a restorative justice training. I'm sorry, Andrea is not here, inside an Irish prison for the guards and the prisoners and the prison administrators. And it was incredibly intense. And it was everything I could do to keep up with everything that was going on between them. High level of confrontation and incredibly powerful resolutions at the end of it. So oftentimes restorative justice takes the form of a circle, some kind of gathering, a facilitated dialogue sometimes where everybody tells their stories about what happens. And everybody in the community now, even if it's facilitated, they're running the show and they're able to participate in asking questions. And they will ask questions that a trained mediator and facilitator wouldn't even think of. What is most fundamental for the facilitator in those settings is to set the tone. to sort of begin with the right attitude and create the right context. A third step in the process happens when the offender acknowledges what they did, apologizes for what they did, agrees to make amends. And in victim offender mediations, this happens because if you aren't willing to go through this process, you may go back into the criminal justice system. But what happens here is probably the most powerful weapon available to anyone in every society is the weapon of ostracism. The ability to say, we reject you. That's pretty intense because you're accepted even in prison. But to be rejected by your society, by your family, by your community, that's pretty tough. But to be accepted by them, in spite of, even because of, on some level, what you have done, that's also incredibly intense. Then what needs to happen, a kind of fourth step, is to design and fine tune, have everybody agree on a program of restitution, compensation. Now, the problem with this is it doesn't always work. That what the victim wants is what the offender can actually provide. But here's an example of a case that I mediated where that was a problem. And it was this. And Vikram, we have an hour and a half, is that right?
Yeah,
So we have,
more than that, Ken, if you want to take continue, it's all as we'll spend as much time as you want.
thank you. So here's the case. A woman is driving along on a freeway, and all of a sudden her windshield shatters into 1,000 pieces, and she can't see anything. And she nearly gets into a collision, but she manages to escape and not do that. Calls the police, and the police come out and they discover on an overpass over the freeway 2 young kids with a BB gun shooting at cars. And they arrest these kids. I think one was 11 and the other was 8 or 9. 2 kids lived close by in the community. And the police looked at this and they said, this doesn't make a lot of sense. Let's try a mediation. So the kids come into mediation. The parents are supposed to come in, but the father is long gone. The mother works 60 hours a week, 2 jobs, and has no time to come in. So they come in with their grandmother. And the opening question is to her, tell us what happened. And now this is the woman who is in the car, and she turns to these kids and she just puts out her finger and she says, "You little sons of bitches," just right in their face. "You nearly killed me." And they're confronted by this and they just start to cry. They're kids. And she realizes, oh my God, these are children. What am I doing? And then she, kind of backs off a little bit and they apologize for what they did. This is not the best way, perhaps, of getting an apology, but it's the way it happened. And then she accepts the apology, and now the question is, how can they repair this damage? Well, I want them to pay for a new windshield. Well, they can't pay for a new windshield. They're children. They don't have jobs. The mother's working. Every penny is going into food for the kids. The grandmother isn't working. The father is long gone. It's not going to work. So I say, well, what if they come over and wash your car on the weekend, for maybe, let's say, a month or 2? Great. Okay, she agrees. She's a little worried about it because she doesn't know how it's going to be having these kids who nearly killed her over to her house, but they come over and they start washing the car. And you can imagine what it must feel like to be them and washing this car. They're washing their sins. And then that works really well. And then this goes on for a couple of weekends. And then the third weekend, it's hot out. And so she brings out milk and cookies for the kids. And then it becomes a ritual. She brings out the milk and cookies. And then they finish washing the car. But she realizes that they've started to have a relationship, and she's a single woman and she needs some things being done around the house. And so she hires them to do work on the weekends around the house. And then several years later, the oldest child decides he's going to go to college. Guess who pays his tuition? And now imagine those kids if they'd gone through juvenile court. Sent to prison, lives destroyed. That's what restorative justice is. So those are several of there are other steps as well. There's the whole set of processes around forgiveness, reconciliation, redemption, reintegration into the community, steps around prevention, systems design, collaborating to prevent future occurrences, even having the kid who committed the crime go out and talk to other potential offenders is a very, very powerful process. They do this because the conflict belongs to them and not to the state. Now, there are a whole bunch of other Indigenous practices that I won't go through, but I can refer you to a series of articles by various people, Robert Niren, Winona Victor, writing about Canadian mediations, Maori mediations, etc. And one of the characteristics also of Indigenous mediations, before passing on, is, and this is based on my experience in multiple Indigenous cultures, is that there is a sense of collective responsibility for the success of the process. And that's really important. And then there is, and this is the part that really actually surprised me, is the immense amount of time that is spent before the process begins, setting the stage for it, and after the process ends, in acknowledging, expressing gratitude, and celebrating the participants, even including in one mediation, dances that are put on by the children from the two tribes who were involved in the mediation. And in one case that I was involved in, a thank you that lasted for several hours. If you can imagine being thanked for several hours, it was quite shocking to me. And something that I really did not expect at all. So now I think what we have to do is to take a look at what happened to all of the various Indigenous ideas and techniques and skills that were created throughout history. And the answer is that most of them were destroyed. Probably maybe 90%. What I've just mentioned is just a small smattering of what actually exists today. And that's a small smattering of what has existed throughout history. What happened? The short answer is colonialism. And I just want to introduce this topic because I think it's important for us to recognize that this system of colonialism had multiple side effects that are visible today. Colonialism, of course, went hand in hand with paternalism. And many of the indigenous societies that I've mentioned were either matriarchal or non-patriarchal in advance of colonialism. But the impact of colonialism in virtually every country included not only the suppression of native cultures, but the suppression of women and children and others. So there are a lot of books that have been written about colonialism, and I don't want to go through them in detail. The essence of colonialism, I think, can be described quite simply. It consists really of three fundamental things to which others can be added. First, domination. Second, theft. And third, suppression of opposition or resistance. In addition to that, there's a fourth, which is the systematic undermining of indigenous culture, the language, the religion, the ways of even celebrating and being together, the culture of the colonized. And the purpose of this, of course, can be understood backwards. If you want to take people's natural resources, their land, their plant and mineral resources, their labor and free time, their dignity and self-confidence go along with this. It is necessary, if you're going to steal something, to take from people what belongs to them. It is necessary first to establish your superiority and right to make that choice. Your right, your entitlement to those proceeds. And the rest of it, I think, happens pretty much automatically. And you can see that there are, of course, many, many different forms of colonialism. There's a different form that was taken by the English in the early American colonies in India, in Australia, in Canada, in New Zealand. Every one of the English colonies was a little bit different. But fundamentally, what not only the English, but the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French had in common was essentially the idea that it is necessary for their own development to accumulate resources from others who are less powerful. And as a result of this, what happens is that you create a system that is chronically conflicted. There are chronic conflicts that are endemic to the system. And therefore, conflict resolution, which looks to prevent those conflicts or reduce them, becomes problematic and needs to be suppressed as well, because eliminating the conflict means eliminating the source of the conflict, which means eliminating colonialism itself. And therefore, suppression needs to take place. Here's a quote from a really interesting writer who I think Vikram knows about. His name is Ashish Nandi. He's written about English colonialism in India. He writes about the need to shape even the ways in which people resist and rebel against it. Here's what he says: conformity need not be monitored, dissent has to be. In any hegemony, that is, in any hierarchy, dissent defines the limits and the final shape or legitimacy of the system, not conformity. You are taught to fight established authorities according to the conventions authorized by the authorities themselves, so that rebellion gradually becomes a matter of apprenticeship and learning correct radical praxis according to texts produced in the global citadels of knowledge. I think this is a really brilliant insight into the ways in which even the act of rebellion itself can become colonialized. And he writes this because he's writing to a certain extent about Gandhi, who represented something different. And the principle of nonviolent resistance was powerful in relationship to English colonialism in Gandhi's view, because it didn't slip either into the overt, masculinized, aggressive military form of active fighting, shooting, etc., which the English would actually knew how to handle. But notice how colonialism forces you to choose fighting as an alternative, and then punishes you for doing that. Or, on the other hand, the feminized, in Ashish Nandi's terms, accommodation to colonialism, which basically tries to find ways of surviving within that system. What Gandhi did was to combine those two together to create a feminized masculinity. That is what nonviolent resistance is about. It is about a form of resistance that essentially ties the colonial idea in a knot. There's another, probably one of the most brilliant writers about colonialism is a man whose name is Albert Memmi. He wrote a book called Through North Africa. He and Frantz Fanon were the two principal, sort of North African writers about colonialism. And Memmi wrote a book called The Colonizer and the Colonized, which has a really interesting conversation about the colonizer who identifies with the colonized, and the colonized who identifies with the colonizer. And here's what Memmi writes. The more oppression increases, the more the colonizer needs justification. The more he must debase the colonized, the more guilty he feels, the more he must justify himself, etc. How can he emerge from this increasingly explosive circle except by rupture, explosion? The colonial situation, by its own internal inevitability, brings on revolt, for the colonial condition cannot be adjusted to like an iron collar. It can only be broken. And what he then proceeds to describe is how violence emerges out of the colonial circumstance. And here's what he adds. About this debasement of the colonized. Thus, oppression justifies itself through oppression. The oppressors produce and maintain by force the evils that render the oppressed, in their eyes, more and more like what they would have to be like to deserve their fate. The colonizer can only exonerate himself in the systematic pursuit of the dehumanization of the colonized by identifying himself a little more each day with the colonialist apparatus. And I'm sorry, this is actually Jean-Paul Sartre's introduction to the Memmi's book. And here Sartre says something very powerful. He says, the engine of colonialism turns in a circle. It is impossible to distinguish between its praxis and objective necessity. the system wills simultaneously the death and multiplication of its victims. Really interesting and insightful. And again, there's a ton of stuff that's been written about colonialism. What it, of course, ends with is the possibility of genocide. And these two are related. The colonialist attitude, the attitude of domination, ends with the willingness to eliminate the people who are the problem. In other words, if we define the people as a problem, then the only thing, as the problem, then the only thing naturally to do is to get rid of the people, whoever they may happen to be. Now, what's interesting is that we can also find ways that these attitudes have extended into conflict resolution practices. First of all, clearly by devaluing Indigenous practices, and that devaluation comes today. Even in terms of just looking down on many of these practices as, in quotes, uncivilized, as, in quotes, inferior, whatever they may happen to do. But the reality is that this attitude is one that is intended on the part of the colonizer to isolate their own emotions in order to dismantle their capacity for empathy and compassion. And now, isn't there a way in which everyone in conflict does this? Don't they actually defend themselves against their own empathy and compassion for their opponent by dehumanizing, debasing, dismissing their legitimate concerns? What does mediation then represent? The exact opposite. And now we can see why there is so much resistance to what it is that we do on the part of the parties who are going through the process. One piece of that process for them has to be to look at the ways that they have defended themselves against their own knowledge. Did the slave owners know that the people they enslaved were human beings? Well, of course, they denied it emphatically in 1,000 different ways, but subconsciously, they knew. And what happens when you treat someone badly who you know doesn't deserve it? The answer is your own conscience rises up against you. It magnifies the fear. It prevents you from even having a decent, ordinary human conversation with people on the other side. And so we can see that this larger problem of colonialism isn't just a problem of nation states. It's a problem of everybody on on a tiny little level, everybody who is in conflict, who wants to try to get their self-interests met, even through domination, even through the humiliation of the other side, etc. Right? So we can go into this in great detail, but here's what I want to suggest to you. We need to stop for a bit and think about how these large-scale political institutions like colonialism have a very, very tiny, small-scale representation, like a little replica in virtually every conflict. And we can see it in marriages. We can find it in families. We can see it in the workplace, in attitudes that people have within communities to other races, genders, social groups. And now what do? I think the answer is a generic one. We have to decolonize not just our global relations with one another, we have to decolonize mediation practices. Now, what does this consist of? Well, this is actually a much larger conversation. On the surface, mediation seems to have little or no connection with colonialism, or with colonial domination, or with theft, or with any of those sorts of things. But of course, domination has 1,000 different forms, and so does theft. You can steal all kinds of things, including peace of mind, including dignity and respect, including the right to speak and say what is true for you. And what stands in the way of doing that? One of the things is the ability to suppress emotion. And this also is in service of patriarchy, because women are identified by men as having strong emotional lives, and as a defense against their own emotional knowledge, their own subconscious awareness, it is necessary to distance, to really compartmentalize the different parts of their lives. And compartmentalization is in service of suffering. So what we need to take a look at is what do we have to actually do to reverse these assumptions? And some of this comes directly from mediation practice, because it's a part of what we absolutely do in every mediation. When we ask questions that invite people into a emotionally authentic conversation with one another, when we invite them to see who they actually are and who the other person actually is. And these two things, of course, go together. Self and other co-define each other. You cannot suppress the other without suppressing some part of the self. And so there is a consequence to prejudice, to bias. And so raising the issues of bias and prejudice is really important, but it's much, much deeper than that. What we also have to do is to look at how we organize our practices. Here's a story. You may know about John Paul Lederek, who is one of the premier mediators in the United States. He was the head of the Mennonite Conciliation Service. He was doing a mediation training program in Mexico many years ago. And all of the participants were Mexican. The situation was from Mexico. It was done in Spanish. And they did this mediation. And at the end of it, he asked people, well, what did you think? And one guy raised his hand and said, you all sound like gringos, North Americanos. Okay, now what was that about? The answer was the process itself had been designed, and not even designed, it had been kind of just taken on board without critical examination. And nobody had ever had a voice in being able to say, is this really the way we ought to do it? And so that prompted him to develop something that is called the elicitive approach to cultural differences. And here's an example of what happened to me. I went to do a training in Nicaragua between members of the Sandinista government and members of the opposition, and with a group of other trainers. And we started off talking about conflictos in Spanish. And they were looking at us like, what? We don't understand. And then finally they got it and they said, oh, no, you mean desacuerdos, disagreements. Oh, yeah, now we get it. Because of disagreement here in Nicaragua, that's one thing. Conflictos, that's different. That's warfare. Okay. So once we had the language to describe what it was that happened, then we had to say, how many words are there for the kinds of conflicts that you experience in your culture? And what do you do with each one of those words? And what works and what doesn't work? And can we elicit from within your culture the things that you do that are actually successful? And instead of coming in like typical gringos or North Americanos and saying, okay, our approach is the right one, forget everything you learned, that's colonialism. Instead, what we want to do is to say, we want to work with you. We want to partner with you. We want to learn from you, as well as you learning from us. So let's share our learnings, our resources, and see what we can both figure out. And now we've got a basis for talking. And now, where do you get stuck? Well, here are some things that are done in some other cultures that might be adaptable to yours, and you could become more effective. And they could be made consistent with the other stuff that you do, so it doesn't look like it is brought in from the outside. So that's basically what I think the project is. And I'm hopeful that these conversations that you're stimulating, Vikram, are going to lead us in the direction of understanding this stuff. There's a lot of anthropological literature that is wonderful, from Malinowski and structural anthropology and a whole bunch of different areas that are absolutely fabulous, from looking at how different cultures have handled conflict. More importantly than that, what we want to do is to acknowledge that every couple is a culture. Every family is a culture. And now what is our project? To use exactly these decolonizing methodologies to invite people to say what works for them and what doesn't. And then talk about what works for others and see whether those can be made consistent with what they do, right? So what is this project? It is the elimination of the one-size-fits-all approach everywhere in conflict resolution. It is the active participation of everybody in the process. It is the heartfelt, supportive confrontation that I talked about earlier. It is restorative justice. And who was it? Cornel West, I think, said, something like, love is what justice looks like socially. Something like that. I don't think I have his exact quote right, but I think that there's something really true about this. This is love made manifest. What is love? It is a high regard for the other that reverberates within the self. So I think this is what we have to learn from Indigenous cultures: how to love one another, how to be together, how to value our community and our relationship with one another, how to find what is best in all of us, how to forgive, how to return to mercy, how to reconcile. I think that's our big project. So thank you, Vikram, for inviting me.
Thank you. No, thank you, Ken. But the only thing is that the symposium that's coming up on 15 September on colonization, decolonization, and mediation. Of
Yes.
course, I want you to give the inaugural address there, but you said you didn't have time. We can record it anytime from today to 15 September, and I'll upload it on that day. So because that's important. I mean, this aspect is connected, yes, but that's also something that we have to discuss. That's an important topic. And Robin, of course, is someone who's going to be part of that. She has lots to say there. But
No,
I'm not letting
Robin's
you go.
very good on this. Has a lot of experience working with prisons in Texas, and I think it will have a lot to say about this.
But only thing is, Ken, we can't let you go because the people wanting to definitely speak to you. But before that, what I'm going to do is let me put up you mentioned about the book So let me just tell people that if they go to the mediatorvikram.com and celebrating Ken Cloke, on the bottom they'll find where they can buy the book. Robin publishes them, so they can click here and they'll get a. I hope Robin, the discount still stays. If you use the word Vikram, you'll get a 25% discount. Let me put that up there. So what I wanted to do, of course, Elizabeth had some question and a comment. We'll get her later. At least meet some of the speakers. I just want you to meet some of them. So who
Yes.
are here?
I just have about 5 minutes.
Yeah. So let's just quick. I think Angela, you want to just quickly tell Ken about yourself, and then we'll just.
I don't actually want to take time from others, but
You
I
have to tell us
really
about
feel,
yourself. Yeah. About
I
yourself.
feel really honored and privileged to be on this, and thank you so much. I'm living in Jerusalem. I'm doing advocacy to the diplomatic community, to journalists, working at grassroots with Bedouin indigenous people and with Palestinians, running a Palestinian nonprofit that is trying to fight the colonialism.
There's a wonderful mediator, professor of mediation in Israel, Ran Kuttner, Rankuttner. You can look him up, tell him I said to say hello. He may be helpful to you.
She's doing interesting work there. So of course, I don't know, Robin, I don't know whether you need to, she has to introduce herself, but let Lucy doing wonderful work. Lucy, you want to tell Ken about?
Oh, thank you. And I'm so sorry I need to leave for another call. I'm based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Ken, we met on a panel a few months ago.
Yes.
Wonderful to hear, just a joy and a heartwarming experience to spend time with you. I do a lot of work with Indigenous people in the US. We'll be talking about that later on the 20th. And thank you, Vikram, so much for putting all this together.
Thank you, Rob. I mean, it's nice to, if you had spent more time, tell us about yourself, because there is lots of work that you're doing, which people not have to hear, but we'll hear about it in your session. So thank you very much. So Ken, Faith is in Kenya. Faith, you want to tell Ken about yourself?
Thank you, Vikram. It was such an honor being in this call. Ken, that was awesome. Just listening to all the beautiful stories. I am Faith. I live in Kenya, Nairobi, and I work with communities. I work with schools. I work with a lot of other people in mediation. And it is very heartwarming to hear all the beautiful skills and practices that happen in Africa. We are elated to know that there is something we can give back to the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Faith. And Grace, I don't know whether Grace can actually put on her video, because Africa has a bit of a connectivity issue. So that definitely is a problem. So what I will do is, of course, our official translator, let him also tell us about himself, because he's been so nice to offer. If there's someone who doesn't know English too well, he'll translate into Spanish.
Hello.
So Sebastian, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself? Then Grace, I'll get you after that. Yes,
Well,
Sebastian.
I'm just a translator and an English teacher. I live in Ecuador. I come from a multicultural family. My father is from Ecuador. My mother's from the United States, and yeah, so I've dedicated my life to teaching English and translating. And,
Okay.
it was great to meet
Thank
you.
you,
And it was
Mediator
amazing
Vikram.
to
The
hear those
dark, we
stories.
have no
Ken.
lights. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So just
Thanks.
want to say thank you very much for the session. It was very, very impressive. And
Grace, I think you'll have a signal issue. I think there's no electricity also there, is what she's saying. Grace, you muted yourself. You're on mute. You're on mute. Okay. But they have a problem. I think Madhu will just tell us. He's still right now not a speaker, but I hope he's going to be a speaker. He's based in Australia, so I don't know what time he's at. So Madhu, you want to just tell us about yourself?
Hello, good morning, everyone. It's Madhu from Australia. Originally, I'm from Nepal, so I'm doing the community mediation here. I'm especially working with the Aboriginal people, with the huge conflict is there. Mainly I'm focused on the community, the conflict, not rather than the individuals. So yes, it's my first time here, and it's midnight here. So yes.
Okay.
I hope I'm enjoying what the speaker is saying, So hopefully I'll learn a lot from here. Thank you, Vikram, for helping me to join here. Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Madhu, for coming in. Yeah, thanks. So we just have Elizabeth with her question and a comment. Yes, Elizabeth, finally, because comments and questions obviously come later. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lizibeth Ramos. I live in Florida, USA. I'm originally from Venezuela. Right now, completing a PhD in conflict analysis and resolution at NSU, and I'm a certified family mediator, and I just love to participate in this symposium and conferences organized by Vikram, which are very encouraging, and I've been learning a lot. And thank you so much to Ken Cloke for the speech that he provided today. I think he really provided an encouraging perspective on how to handle conflict. It seems that loving confrontations can open the path for spreading spiritual energy and at the same time enhancing opportunities for harmony, fairness, and justice. So there is a lot to still learn from that, and I appreciate you being here and teaching us and providing awareness on how to get there, because we really need to learn that to improve the way we practice mediation. So thank you so much.
Your question, comment, you don't want to take that up? You had some comment and question that you put up, Elizabeth. Should I take that up?
Yes, actually, yeah, I was posting a question for Ken Cloke, and I just wanted to ask, how contagious can spiritual energy be? What does it take to get the conflicted parties motivated to spiritually and emotionally participate in the conflict resolution process, based on your experience?
Boy, that is a wonderful question, and there are so many fabulous answers to it. I think the first difficulty is to define what spiritual means. If you define it as religious, then of course it becomes difficult because everybody has different religious beliefs. But if you define it as awareness, as being in the present, then we can draw people into the present in a variety of different ways, including stopping and just slowly asking people to come into the conversation. We bring them into spirituality through authenticity, through our own authenticity. And by talking from their hearts about what they believe in. For example, in families that are having disputes over an inheritance, we can ask the question, tell me about your mother. Tell me about your father. What did you love about them? What do you think they would have wanted you to do? You know, those kinds of questions are heart-opening questions and fundamentally spiritually informed questions. How many are there? Thousands. There's a Sufi poet whose name is Rumi, who wrote centuries and centuries ago. Here's what he says, and I'll use this as a close. Keep your intelligence white hot and your grief glistening, so your life will stay fresh. Cry easily like a little child. Do not seek any rules for worship. Say whatever your pained heart chooses. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
And Elizabeth should know that there was a symposium in April on heart, soul, spirituality, and mediation. So Ken also gave the inaugural address there also.
Yes.
So Ken, thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's always
Pleasure.
a pleasure. Always a pleasure. And I'm going to take time from you for recording that inaugural address, which will then be uploaded later. So I'll take time for you that. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. And thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.